Hello, and welcome to Eloqua Office Hours. This is our monthly get-together where we dig into marketing automation, share what's working, and tackle the questions you've been wrestling with. Your questions are what make this work, so a quick thank you to everyone who sent one in ahead of today. When we wrap up, you'll see a short survey. If you've got a minute to fill it out, it generally helps us make these better. We're recording today, and the replay link will land in your inbox tomorrow. And stick around to the end. We've got a little something to share before we close out. Now let's get started. I'm Sebastian Martinez, account director here at Forethought Marketing, and I'll be your host today. Presenting today is Richard Holder, our director of marketing at Forethought. He's been in the marketing operations world for a long time. Before I hand it over to Richard, a couple of quick notes. If something comes to mind while Richard's talking that you want to ask, and we hope it does, drop it in the Q&A panel. That way, we can keep track of everything and get to as many as we can. And if there's something you'd like us to cover in a future session, throw that in there too. We read every suggestion. And with that, over to you, Richard.
All right, thank you, Sebastian, and especially thankful for Sebastian because he went to a concert last night and his voice is a little rough, so I really appreciate you coming in today. So over the past year, the team here at Forethought Marketing has been running internal AI experiments. And we've been doing this mostly so that we can get some hand-on experience on where it can actually help us doing our job well. Our team's focused primarily on productivity. A lot of people are working on solutions that look at your data, that do analytics and so forth. We focused more on how can we make marketing teams more efficient and trying to apply that to everyday problems that we see. The problem, your Eloqua instance, despite all the preparation that you have, some of those submissions are never going to be customers. Some of them are spam, and I don't mean the obvious kind that gets caught in your existing controls. I mean the stuff that's gotten smarter. Plausible looking names, sometimes gibberish, free email addresses with numeric suffixes, names and comments that are also gibberish or completely blank. There's even sophisticated new AI techniques that get around many of these controls, and we still see many people manually entering spam information just trying to get in. And we thought that there was perhaps another way we could help with this. And we wanted to look beyond just spam. We said some of these submissions are probably vendor solicitations. So we wanted to see about separating those. People selling SEO, selling databases, selling marketing services. We even get janitorial and landscape offers here at Forethought Marketing, even though we're a fully remote company. They're all coming through the same form as your actual prospects and use, and they often look legitimate enough for that they end up in your CRM. And then there are leads or something close to leads that are ambiguous enough that someone on your team has to make a judgment call before passing them on to sales. Or maybe you don't, maybe they just flow through. The result is that you're either reviewing manually, which is a time sink, or you're not reviewing at all, which means your sales team is sometimes seeing garbage and they are not trusting because their time is valuable and they want to really focus on closing deals. So for us, it started with spam, and we decided to test if we could use AI to triage instead. That's what I'm going to walk through today. Before we get into the experiment, I want to be clear. Oh, there we go. Wrong slide. Before we get into the experiment, I want to talk about what this is and is not today. This is a walkthrough of something we actually built and tested on our own data. We're going to show you how we designed it, what the results look like, and where it failed, because it did fail in some interesting ways. And this is also not a product announcement. What I hope is that you walk away with enough of a read on the approach we decided to take, whether it's worth exploring on your own situation. I also want to flag something up front because before we go any further, I'm going to give it its own slide. Data privacy and compliance are real requirements for any kind of production AI deployment. If any of you have been working on these kinds of deployments, you're very familiar with it. It is not optional and it is not simple. Our experiment focused solely on whether AI can classify form submissions and did not consider what a production-ready, legally compliant system would require. Implementing such a system would involve your legal, security, data protection teams before handling live data. I'm carving this out explicitly because I don't want anyone walking away thinking we skipped that part. We scoped it out on purpose. Any real path forward is something like this has to go through a full compliance assessment. We're just not going to cover that part today. And with that said, let me get on to the experiment. So this is how we set it up, starting with the data. We pulled a sample of form submissions from our contact form going back far enough to when we experienced a significant increase in spam submissions that were getting past all of the controls that we had put up there. This was actually quite surprising to us because until then we'd done a very good job of keeping that stuff out. The rest were a mix of vendor solicitations and legitimate leads. But this is probably not a surprise to most of you because you're going to see the same kind of situation. Most of the records that got through were spam, and they were all nearly identical, differing only slightly in the garbage data, such as different first names, last names, email address before the domain. We then used AI responsibly to analyze that data set to identify submission patterns because we didn't want to test on the entire data set. We wanted to be able to iterate through examples of the different kinds of things, spam, vendor pitches, inquiries, and we kept one example for each pattern. And this resulted in a total of 29 records. Each one represents a real scenario that we've seen. So then we decided to run it. We used two models, ChatGPT 4o Mini and from OpenAI and Claude Haiku, deliberately choosing the smallest, least expensive options to test. We aimed to see if these basic models could reliably handle the task. As using more capable models like the higher 4.0 and Claude Sonnet might have limited our understanding of the approach's requirements. We ran both models against the same 29 records with the same prompt to see what they agreed and where they split. The splits actually turned out to be some of the most interesting data in the experiment. One more design decision worth flagging. We started with zero information about forethought marketing in the prompt. Nothing about who we are, what we do, or what a lead looks like for us. We did that intentionally to test that the AI could figure this out on its own or if it needed some help. That decision also produced some important findings, which I'll show you shortly. So let's get in to what this actually looks like. So here's the entire workflow that I built inside of N8n. There are a total of 10 nodes. And let's take a closer look at the proof of concept data set and the run config on the left-hand side. The code node stores the data set as a JSON array containing the contact, the anonymized contact information, the first and last names, email addresses, and comments. It also holds the expected outcome, which was determined in advance by a human review. Then we have the run config. This node does two things. It holds an iteration identifier that was written to the results sheet when every classification runs. So that way we can keep each test result run separate and trace which prompt produced which results. It also holds the system prompt that both models use. And this was done on purpose because we wanted to be able to tweak the prompt a little bit and then run a new run, but have both models pick it up and not have to update it in two places. This prevented drift and no copy paste mistakes between the two branches. And as a reminder, if you have questions, please use the Q&A. And that way we can keep it organized. Thank you for your questions. Let me move to the next slide. Okay, so the evaluation nodes. On the right-hand side, the flow moves the same data through two sequences. First, ChatGPT and then Claude. Each branch has a parse step that takes the information coming out of the AI and normalizes it and extracts the classification the AI gave and the rationale, then writes it to a Google Sheet. That's really the whole thing. And we didn't use any developers. This was tooling that we did ourselves inside of marketing operations. And if you're already using a tool like Innate or a similar workflow tool like Make or others, you should be able to easily replicate this kind of architecture. And here's what the output looks like. For each record, the sheet captures the model, the iteration, the AI's classification result, and the rationale. There's a match column that flags whether it aligned with what we expected, which is how we evaluated accuracy. One thing I'll say about the data set, 29 records is a starting point. It's not a conclusion, and you will likely need a larger data set if you wanted to try this on your own to be more accurate and realistic. However, for this proof of concept, we had enough to validate the approach. And of course, your results may vary because your data is going to be very different than ours. The rationale field also matters beyond just the evaluation. In a production version, if you were to create something like this, the rationale is going to be your audit trail. Every decision has a written reason attached to it, and that's what you need if anyone ever asked why a submission was routed the way it was. All right, let me show you two interesting records from the experiment. There were a number of things, but the two I'm going to show you now are the most interesting. So the first one is an easy spam case. It's a random name, a Gmail address with a long number, and a blank or gibberish comment. Both models labeled it at spam, citing the domain and the name pattern and the lack of personal information. The AI effectively filters obvious garbage with 100% accuracy. The second record I want to show is one I was very instructive. The comment reads, "I'm reaching out to explore a potential partnership for Eloqua campaign execution services, with some details on email and campaign production per month." ChatGPT incorrectly, I should say, labeled it as vendor, while Claude labeled it correctly as a lead. Now, if you might be asking why, well, a human would easily grasp the intent and classify this as a lead. However, we suspect that the AI saw the word partnership and drew a different conclusion. So this is where you need to understand that the language that people use, if they are more formal, you need to account for that and have the right kind of prompt that will allow the AI to make a better conclusion to it. The other thing we learned about this is we thought that perhaps the model didn't have enough information about forethought marketing, or it had some information about forethought marketing, but not enough to understand exactly what we did. It saw the word Eloqua and partnership, as I mentioned, and it filled in the blank. So for a subsequent run, we added a short paragraph to the prompt, a few sentences on who is forethought marketing, the products and services that we offer, and ran the same record again. In this run, both models got the information correct. That's the big takeaway here. The model wasn't broken. It just lacked the level of detail it needed specifically about our company. So you can't lean on the training data alone. You need to classify as well, and you need to give it enough instructions for your goods and services. This might be better with larger models, but those are slower and are going to be more expensive. So those are also considerations, but we did not test for that in this. So here's the final results. Both models achieved 93% overall accuracy. Spam was 100% for both models. It's the clearest signal in the data. If cleaning obvious garbage off your queue is your primary goal, the AI handles that category consistently enough to act on today. I want to be clear about what this represents. These are, again, only 29 records. It's not a statistically significant study. However, the structured test against real submission patterns from our own form and a 93% on the triage tool, where the misses go to human review rather than directly to your CRM, that's likely a workable starting point. One thing worth flagging in the category breakdown, which we found interesting, is the two AI models diverged, and ChatGPT was stronger on identifying vendors, and Claude was stronger on leads. Don't know why. That's for the more scientific people in the room. But that diversion is on the harder categories, but it is useful information. The other result that held up was the rationale field. Every classification came back with a written reason that referenced only the email domain. It did not include the names, the email addresses. Those were not echoed back. And that was a deliberate design choice. Every decision in the system is auditable, and nothing personally identifying ends up in the output log. The bottom line in all of this, the AI handles with the high confidence cases well. That's spam. The ambiguous cases need a human. What it does is dramatically reduce the volume of submissions that require human attention, or potentially. So your team can focus on the ones that actually needs judgment. That's the value. It's not zero human touch automation. And okay, so let me go on to the next slide. Just a reminder to submit your questions so we can take a look at those. All right, so here's our perspective. The experiment demonstrated that AI can reliably handle a meaningful portion of form submission triage. Spam classification is essentially solved for the patterns we tested. Vendors with explicit pitch language can be accurately classified once you give the model adequate context about your company. And the prompt needs to be tuned to your specific context. What a lead looks like for you, what services you offer, what your threshold is for borderline cases. And as I mentioned up front, the compliance questions around any production deployment are real and require their own processes. We didn't address those today, but they would need to be addressed before you went into production. And we've even considered how we would automate a review and refinement process, but we didn't actually run any of those experiments. What I take away from this approach is it is viable. The accuracy floor is high enough on the easy cases to be commercially useful. The improvement path is clear. You can trace every misclassification back to a specific gap in the prompt and fix it. And that's actually a pretty good foundation. So to summarize everything here, everything we built, the innate workflow, the prompt structure, the dataset design is available on request. If you want to look at it and think about whether it applies to your situation, just reach out. Where this goes from here is a longer conversation. I'm happy to have a one-on-one with anyone who's interested. That's what the rest of this session is for. So Bring your questions that you have about this experiment, about Eloqua. We'll open the floor here in a moment. One thing I'll say before we open up, this isn't a product we're selling. It's a problem we experienced ourselves, and we wondered whether AI could be a solution. If that's useful to you, great. If it raises more questions than it answers, that's also useful. Ask them. All right, that is the end of my presentation. Let me turn it back to you, Sebastian, for the questions.
All right. Great presentation, Richard. Thank you. As a reminder, if you have questions, please use the Q&A option. And we do have a couple of questions. Let's start off with Brandon. So, Richard, the question is, would you use this in addition to a separate email validation vendor like @Data or as a replacement?
That's a great question. If you already have a solution like that data, maybe AI isn't what you need. Maybe it provides the best. We didn't go in saying we wanted to compare this to an alternate solution. We just said, can AI do this? Um, so, that's if that data is doing an adequate job for you, then that might be as good as anything. But if you have more complex cases, and we started seeing some spam that was not being caught by these types of solutions, then something worth considering. You can run experiments and test whether they will work for you. So great question. Thank you.
Okay. Next question. Can this work with forms that don't have a comment field?
Great question. And my answer would be yes, but the more context that you give to the AI, the better it's going to be able to evaluate. We saw cases where the first name and last name and email address all appeared reasonable. So, it was legitimate first name, legitimate last name, and then it was those two together. Without the comment field, it could go right through. And we've got Donald Trump and other famous names. Historical figures have come through. So, the AI won't necessarily trigger on those. So, having the comments field, I would always recommend. Um, it also helps when you do vendors because a vendor can't resist entering their pitch in the comments field. So that makes it very simple for them to be filtered out. Thank you for your question.
Okay, very good. Next question for you, Richard. Can we get the prompt and workflow?
Yes, yes, we'll make those available. Just reply to the message tomorrow. We need to do some additional sanitation to it before we would make it available, but we would love to. So just let us know.
Okay, very good. Another question. It reads, I'm definitely curious how we could automate this whole process, although recognize the gaps you've mentioned. Have you guys heard anything about an Eloqua MCP server one day?
Oh, so perhaps that's two questions. Thank you for it. So let me cover the first one. In terms of an Eloqua MCP server, I'm aware of one that's available today, not from Oracle. It's from CData. We've actually done experiments with it, and it does a reasonable job. It's more about access to data, and what's the right word? It's great for ad hoc kinds of queries and so forth, but it's not robust enough, in our opinion, to replace an integration. So you can do some clever things with it. It does not replace an integration. In terms of automating it, that's the area around privacy. It's a minefield, really, mostly because it has more to do with agreements and the architecture of where the AI is residing and where the um, the system is hosted. So if you have a completely integrated stack, you have an AI running on your own hosted solution, you're going to have fewer agreements, but you also have data residency issues and so forth. So there are just a lot of factors, and your legal department and your privacy team are going to have requirements that you may not have considered, and because of their expertise. So I would look to that as well.
Okay, perfect. And last question that we have is there a cloud up? Is there a cloud up version of this coming?
I knew this was going to come in. The answer is we are open to having a conversation with the caveat that, again, the design decisions would be important because it's not just us building an app and then giving it to you. There are certain specific agreements that would have to be in place for both us and you, and so we would have to walk through that.
All right, perfect. Thank you, Richard. I will pause briefly to see are there any additional questions. Okay, that's all the questions we have for today. But before you go, we have a few more items. As a special thank you for attending live today, we have some marketing automation swag for you. The replay email will